Welcome to the Zacks Roundtable Review, a discussion of current events affecting investors as well as other topics of financial interest, featuring the analysts and editors of Zacks.com. Well, critics of another round of economic stimulus say there's a real risk of policy not being enough, and that much of the money appropriated to help the economy won't work its way through this whole system until early next year or maybe even beyond that. Meanwhile, there's renewed investor worries over banks and the banking sector. We're going to poll our panelists to get their feelings on both of these topics. Joining us this time around, Editor-at-Large Steve Reitmeister, Senior Market Analyst Charles Rotblatt, and our top stock screener and market technician, Kevin Matris, on this edition of the Roundtable. So that's the real concern as far as the stimulus package goes, as far as I can tell. I'm seeing stories all the time. Critics of the plan, the Obama plan, say money's not going to work its way through the system early enough to give us relief now. And people are more into relief now than 2010 or 11 or beyond that. What do you think?
Well, I think you got to look at the plan from two angles. First of all, a lot of what he's talking, and it really goes back to really what he campaigned on. A lot of it's longer-term projects. He's talking about redoing the energy grid. He's talking about rebuilding schools. He wants to computerize medical records. He wants to make federal buildings more efficient. He wants to secure the ports, on and on and on. These are long-term projects. Even if we get the budget passed tomorrow, we put all the money into it, it takes time. So you have to have the plans. You've got to hire the contractors. You've got to secure the materials for it. So,
and as we said, maybe some retraining along the way.
Exactly.
Right?
So a lot of these are long-term plans. It's not going to have immediate impact. I think short-term, obviously, there's some things he wants to do in terms of unemployment that will help people. Cutting taxes will help, and that's something that can be implemented immediately. But you know what? The simple fact is Congress operates on its own timetable, regardless of what Reid and Pelosi want to say. And I'm not attacking them because they're Democrats, but the reality is legislation always gets stalled up. It never comes out the way people expect. And I think for people all of a sudden now, a few days into administration, going, oh, well, it's going to take longer than we thought. Well, it's kind of like, well, did you really think that we're going to have this package, in place before the end of January? Mm-hmm. That was all just very wishful thinking. Okay.
What do you think? Charles says no news there. The other argument is that, by the time you put policy in action, that the economy and the markets are going to cycle around and do what they're going to do anyway. And so there's that argument.
Yeah, it's a fair concern. A lot of people are thinking that, hey, if this money isn't even going to hit the economy until, let's say, 2011 or 2012, why even bother? But again, as Charles had said, when you're planning these big long-term projects, there's a lot of time and thoughtfulness that goes into these kinds of things. But what's interesting, and I read this over the weekend, and I think it's good news, is there has been this pledge that has been sent around to the Office of Management and Budget, and the pledge is starting to gain momentum where 75% of the money will be spent in 2009 and 2010. I think this is good news because some earlier estimates had said that as little as only 20 or 25% was going to be spent in 2009. So I think that if they can try to get this money into the economy sooner as opposed to later, I think that's a good thing. But as Charles had said too, I think a lot of people are worried that this package, as it's rushing through Congress, is just going to be loaded down with a ton of pet pork barrel spending projects. And in that regard, if they can strip those things from the bill, I think that would be the right thing to do.
But a couple of weeks ago, we all kind of agreed that something has to be done. That's why we elect these officials.
That's correct. And there's only a few things that are in their arsenal that can be done in the short term, and almost all are on the tax front, whether that be a tax rebate check, which is probably the weakest of all things that can be done because most of them just go into savings or pay down debt and don't really go to stimulate the economy. To do temporary tax cuts is slightly better than the rebate check. But because it's temporary, people know that they don't really make the changes in their behavior to work more, or if the changes are made on the corporate side to lower payroll taxes and things of that nature, they will just see it as a short-term giveaway and won't really hire people for the long term, which is what they want to do. So something that is more lasting in the tax code. If they can put something in that is lasting in the tax code, not just seen as a stopgap to make people, that would be very similar to the economy, especially if it is the corporations to help secure jobs that are already in place and hopefully to add jobs to stimulate the economy. That's the best they can do in the short run.
Well, it seems to me, too, that this economic downturn is hitting industries specifically. You know, Charles and I had talked in another piece about the weakness spreading further. That seems to be the common theme throughout different sectors and different industries. So you're reading headlines every day about more jobs being cut for XYZ companies. But you see a headline this morning like McDonald's adding 1,000 new stores. So somebody's doing business out there.
Well, I mean, there are companies doing businesses, typically the companies who are actually catering more towards a frugal consumer, or in the case of a company like Aaron Rents, where people really don't have any choice to go down, other than to go to them because they cannot get credit anywhere else. But on the flip side, you're seeing a lot of companies across the spectrum struggle, and we're in a recession. When you're in a recession, it hits multiple companies. It's not a thing where, the housing bubble popped and that's why housing's doing bad. You're seeing companies across. There's lower demand. It's harder to get credit, and that's going to affect everything. And I think that's going back to Steve's point. When you look at what can you do immediately, it really comes down to taxes. If you cut people's taxes, payroll taxes, for instance, there's an immediate benefit to the paycheck, and if people think it's permanent, they might start spending it more. Same thing if you give businesses, you go to a business, we'll give you a tax break if you hire people. That spurs, again, some growth and some money that's immediately spent. When you start talking things that are either one time or just temporary, then you don't get the immediate impact that you would with a tax cut that has a feeling of being permanent.
Then we have this renewed concern on the part of investors and bank industry watchers in the past week that there might be some more problems than we thought creeping up from the banking sector. You think, Kevin, that headlines like I read on the wires, bank failures to flare up in 2009, have anything to do with those renewed concerns?
Well, I think investors, are rightly concerned. It was financials that got us into this mess in the first place. With bad lending practices, underappreciation for risk, the huge amount of over-leverage, and people are wondering, what these banks can possibly do to get themselves out of this mess. While it's true, the government's intervention, has been helpful to be able to back these assets and to be able to guarantee depositors' money. A lot of people are worried that, how much additional ownership is the government going to take in these institutions? And from an investor standpoint, how much dilution is that going to cause in their stock position? I think another thing that has people concerned, and me as well, is that now, because they gave all this money to the banks, but they haven't been lending it. So now people are worried about rule changes, whereas people are now going to be forced to loosen their credit standards to get money in consumers' hands. But that is the very thing that got us into this mess in the first place. Yep. So, there's a lot of anxiety over the financial sector. The other part, which I think everybody is very cognizant of, is the deleveraging. Since they were so massively over-margined in the first place, when a lot of their assets collapsed, that is why they got into so much trouble. So even if there wasn't a recession, if you're going to be earning less for every $1 of assets you have, that alone is going to cause reduced earnings. You combine that with the financial turmoil that we have, that's a double whammy.
Well, Kevin brings up a couple of good points. It seems like we're in a no-win situation with these banks.
I hate to say no win because that makes it sound like we're never going to come out. But, somewhere, somehow, a healthy banking system will emerge, and that's where they keep talking about the concept of the bad bank, the creation of a bad bank who takes all the yucky stuff off all the good banks' hands and pulls it away from them, and so they can be healthy, and the bad bank, which is some government entity, has all the stuff on their books, which is kind of what TARP's meant to do, but it's not the full charter of what TARP is currently set up as. But what I'll say this morning, doing my morning routine, and I'm watching CNBC, they had an economic advisor to the administration on there. He was asked how the banking system looked. He goes, "We don't know." Wow, what a good answer. That was one of the scariest answers I'd ever seen. It was an honest answer. I'll give him credit for not blowing smoke up people's backside, but it was very scary. They really don't know the depth of how bad it is. And so that's where some of the other folks who were part of their roundtable type discussion was, how many rounds of TARP are we talking about? Right. Okay, and really there's going to be many generations. So On the downside, we don't know how bad it is. On the upside is that there's no shortage of what these guys will do to help shore up the banks, because they know they need some form of healthy banking system to keep the economy rolling, and so they're very committed to that process.
But Charles, is absorbing the toxic debt and taking that away from the bank's books enough to get these banks lending again?
Well, I think it will certainly help, and it's been a problem because none of the banks really trust each other to lend money, and that's part of the problem. I mean, the other part of the problem is you're going to see bad debt among consumers continue to rise, and that's going to have banks skittish. You're going to see businesses who are struggling for no other reason that we're in a recession default on their debt, either bonds or direct loans, and that's going to weigh on banking psychology. So, again, to a very real point, this is a psychological problem. We do have fiscal problems behind it, but it's also a psychological problem. Like, going to what Steve said about the I don't know comment, we've talked about this before. All throughout 2008, we've seen 2009 earnings estimate for banks being slashed. Now we're in 2009. We're continuing to see them slashed. And it's interesting. You're seeing companies like today, as we record this on Monday, shares of RBS jump up simply because they're indicating that we're okay, we're solvent. Same thing with Barclays. They had some news out there. And so when you start seeing news that, you know what, we'll survive in the stock rallies, we'll survive is not good news. You want to hear from your company, hey, we've come with a new product, a new line of business, we're getting market share, we're doing things right. Not that, oh, we'll have our doors open tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Well, we are going to keep our eye peeled for further developments in both the banking sector and on the economy, and we will be here for you to bring you the latest opinions from the folks at the round table. I'm Terry Ruffalo.